In this video, we're going to cover how to connect a custom application to a Fabric semantic model so we can issue DAX queries against that semantic model and use them within the application. So this is building on a previous video where I went through how to connect a React app to Entra ID as an identity provider and use it for a source of access tokens. So we're just going to take this one little step further and fetch access tokens that we can use to connect to Fabric Semantic Model. We will need to do a couple of setup steps in the Entra configuration first. We have to add some Power BI API permissions. So we'll go through how to add the API permissions, how to authorize them, changes we need to make to the custom app to do the queries, and then we'll go ahead and run a query against the Fabric model and show you that it works. So let's get into it. First, let's go into Fabric and look at the semantic model that we're going to query so we can see what we're actually going to do. So here's the model I'm going to use. It's a bike shop sentiment analysis, and I'm just going to do a very simple query of the language and the number of reviews that are in the database. So I can see German is 26, English is 96, and so on. We're going to need a dataset ID for this model, and we can get that from the URL within Power BI. So I'm going to grab that from the URL, where it's dataset slash whatever comes after that slash, and grab that UID, save it for later. And the next thing we need to do is go into Entra and update the app registration to add the API permissions for the Power BI APIs that we're going to call. So I'll go into app registrations, find the app registration corresponding to the React app we're using, which is this one. Then we'll just go into API permissions. We're going to add a permission. Actually, we're going to add two. We'll find the Power BI permissions, and the ones I'm looking for are dataset. So I'll add the dataset read all and read write all. Now those are added, but they need to be consented. So I'm going to add admin consents. So I'll click on the first one and grant consent. I'll say yes. And as soon as I get those green check marks, that means the consent's been added for all users in the directory. So before we get started changing this application, let's just refresh our memory what it looks like now. So I'll go back and run it to localhost 3000, and we can take a look at this app and see how it works. I get a login Entra ID. So let me go and make sure the login's still working. And this login will test whether the app registration is, or the application registration is still working. And it looks like it is. I have a token. That's my ID token, not my Power BI token. But this is all looking fine, so let's go ahead and get this off the screen and start modifying the application. The first thing we'll do is to add the UI that we're going to use for this function. So I'm going to add a button that I press when I want to run a query. I'll also have an input box where I can type in the query I want to run. That'll be DAX. And an output area where it'll show me the output that it receives from the model after queries. And if I look at the code, I have some errors because I haven't defined a state variable for DAX query and query result yet. I also need to have a set DAX query function that's defined, and I need a button handler for handle query semantic model. So let's step those in now. We'll add the state variables for DAX query and query result here. And that looks like everything is cleaned up except for the event handler. So let's stub in the event handler for the button. Let's go ahead and implement the button handler for the query semantic model. The first thing we need to do is get an access token that's specific to Power BI. So in this case, our scope will be analysis.windows.net/powerbi/API. So we'll log in, click the Query Fabric Semantic Model button, and we can see what token we actually get when we use that scope. And as before, if we want to examine the content of that token, we can just copy to the clipboard, go to jwt.ms, paste it in, and we can look at what claims it has. Now if we look at the content of the token, we can see the audience is analysis.windows.net/powerbi/API. So this is the right kind of token to send to Power BI, and we'll be able to call that service. Now let's implement the rest of the function. Let's create a variable to capture that dataset ID that we pulled out of Fabric when we were looking at the dataset interactively. Then we'll construct a URL to api.powerbi.com that embeds the dataset ID that we want to query. In the header, we'll specify that the authorization to use is the bearer token that we got from acquire token silent. Next, we construct the request body, which is the JSON object that includes the text DAX query. That DAX query variable is going to be what the user puts into the text box on the screen later on when we run the app. Next, we'll use the fetch function to call the URL we constructed above with the headers and the payload that we've just put together and wait for a response. Now that we have that response, we're going to extract it as a JSON object. Response data is a nested JSON object. What we're really interested in is going to the first result set and the first table in the result set and grabbing the rows. To display those rows to the user, we're going to take the JSON object that we have and split it up into something like a markdown table, and we'll display that on the screen. So we'll write a short helper function for that called format as table. And we'll call format as a table. That'll come back as a string, and then that string will use the a setter to write that string to the UI. So that should do it. Let's go ahead and run it and see if it works. I'm going to clear the console, and let me get a query to paste in here to test with. Paste that in. So that's going to give us the language and count of reviews, same as we did in the Power BI UI. Then we rerun that. Here's our output table. So we have German 26, Italian 5, and so on. So that's the result. So that worked. Okay, that's it. We're all done. So let's just summarize what we did. So we looked up the dataset ID for the target semantic model in Fabric. That was the UUID that we found on the URL when we were looking at the semantic model. We then added API permissions to Entra to the app registration. So we added dataset read all and dataset read write all from the Power BI section. That gives us the ability to enumerate datasets as well as query datasets. The next thing we did was to update the React UI with just the UI query response, give us something to interact with. And then we implemented the code to actually go to Entra and get an access token for Power BI for that user that's already logged in. So the key here is that we needed an access token using the Power BI claim, not just the access ID claim that we had before. And then finally, we called the Power BI REST API using that bearer token that we got with the Power BI authority, and we executed the query, and the query came back, displayed it to the user, and that's it. We're all finished. Hope you learned something, and hope this helps with your own applications.